Thank you all for joining TAM Lab 117. Brian is a staff technical adoption manager. He is going to go over the Skyline Inventory Export Report. Brian, thank you for always being available to present for anything TAM related. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure, yeah. Brian Wuchner, like you said, staff TAM, been at VMware or VMware by Broadcom now, about 8 years, based out of Indianapolis, Indiana.
Well, Brian, I'm going to stop sharing and stop my video so that you can take over.
All right, I'll share out my screen here.
All right, you see it.
Cool. All right, so normally I don't talk about dates when we're doing recordings, but we're recording this in April of 2024, and that's relevant because the next slide is going to talk about some changes that happened to the Skyline service in April. But we're going to be covering the Inventory Export Report, and this is a new feature that was introduced back in January to be able to create reports of inventory directly from the Skyline Advisor UI. So as of April 1st, Skyline no longer supports onboarding of new organizations. So this video is kind of primarily focused at folks who've already deployed Skyline and have one or more collectors deployed getting data. And we're going to show how to create some reports using that feature. I guess just a level set on a couple Skyline things, right? Skyline has collectors that get deployed inside of a customer environment. Customers would have one or many of these collectors that are sending metrics to VMware. And those metrics are used to do things like provide proactive findings and recommendations. Starting in January, we have this new insights report, inventory export. But when we go to create a report, if we have a collector that is unhealthy, as we can see from this screenshot here of this dashboard, we've got an environment that has 3 collectors, all of which are unhealthy. Some of those unhealthy endpoints we're not going to be able to include in reports. And so going to that Skyline dashboard and then taking a look at collector health, there's a view all button on this widget. Going in there, it'll show you all of the collectors that are deployed. You'll be able to figure out which endpoints are unhealthy and then take corrective action to fix that. All right, and then the last thing that's a slide before we get into the demo. Some of these inventory exports do have some data points that require collector version 3.3 or higher to be included in the output. Kind of a moot point on what version of collector you're running, because as of this recording, only collector version 3.5 and higher are supported. So if you're running something lower than that, again, you can see that on that dashboard. When you drill into view all of the collectors, you can see what version is running. If you're running an older version, each collector has the ability to turn on this auto update feature. Definitely recommend it. You just schedule it to check every day or weekly or whatever the case may be for updates, and keep itself current. And that way you won't run into an issue where there might be missing data in a report. All right, enough slides here. We'll break out a PowerPoint. We'll get into Skyline demo. Again, we're in skyline.vmware.com/advisor. And so this is the landing page, kind of public facing entry point for customers. And right here, kind of front and center, we can see that all of my collectors are healthy. And we could drill in and go find out why, so that we could get those fixed. But again, the focus of this session is on the inventory reports. So we go to the Insight Reports tab, and what we'll see is a new button here called Inventory Export Reports. So we're going to go ahead and just create an inventory export report, and we'll give it a name. I'm just going to paste in TAM Lab 117. We'll expand our inventory here, and we'll kind of talk through some of the products that are supported. In this kind of test organization that we're using. Basically every product with the exception of NSXV that are supported by Skyline are deployed and added to this organization. So we could go through and pick various endpoints to report on. Going to start with vCenter, right? This is actually probably the most popular report type, is to look at vCenter stuff. And we can see from this screen that there are a handful of unhealthy collectors denoted in red that we can't report on. We can check the box for all of the vCenters, and it'll include all of the ones except those that are unhealthy. We can go through and click various drop downs here to look at other endpoints and whatnot. For purposes of this demo, I'm just going to include two, right? The vCenter report and then one VMware Cloud Foundation environment. So what's going to happen after I hit create is the process going to kick off to create two reports, and I'll end up getting two separate emails telling me that reports were created. One report is going to include all of these vCenters. The other report is going to include VMware Cloud Foundation, and then all of the supporting data related to this VCF environment that Skyline is aware of. So go ahead and hit create. This takes a couple of minutes for these reports to kind of kick out. So I've got kind of pre-saved copies of reports that we can actually continue with. I guess before I get into just firing up this kind of next thing on some of these reports, are there any questions out there from folks on the call?
I have not seen any in the chat, but I did have one question. Are you logged in as a VMware Broadcom employee, or are you logged in as a customer right now?
Great question. So I am logged in with VMware credentials, but into the customer-facing portal, right? So as this is what a customer would see.
That's what I thought. I just wanted to make sure.
Correct.
Brian, are you going to cover what's the difference between this inventory report and the TAM report?
Oh, great question. Yeah, so and I think we had talked about like maybe at the end of the demo here, stopping recording and doing some of the kind of internal question and answer stuff. But just for while these reports are generating, we'll toggle over. Again, I'm in the system as a customer. So if I go over to TAM reports, what I'll see are reports that TAMs have created and delivered to customers, right? So I, as a customer in this view, wouldn't be able to create an inventory export. There's that viewer portal for internal folks to be able to access, and they would have different options, and we'll cover those at the end.
Perfect.
All right, so our reports are still running. I'm going to go ahead and fire up a vCenter version of one of these reports. At least try to. There we go. All right, so after this runs, I'll get an email. The email will take me back to this advisor portal, and I could click, there'll be a little download button on here to actually download this spreadsheet, and I can open this spreadsheet. And so I've got some notes of things to go through, happy to entertain questions as well. But I guess just from the mechanics of this vCenter report, kind of the first place I want to start isn't the leftmost tab like most folks would start on with a spreadsheet. Actually, like going out here to the last tab at the end. There's a couple just kind of environmental things that get tracked in these last two tabs. This first tab being report status. There's a kind of a post-process thing that as this report gets generated, there's like some sanity checks that run against the data. And if there's an issue, like a known issue that's causing a problem with the report, such as environments don't have the right permissions to collect licensing details, for example, there might be a informational message here on this last page that says, you may want to check the permissions of the service account that's running Skyline, that sort of thing. Or if there were just any sort of report generation errors, again, that are kind of known and documented, they'll show up on this last tab. So in this case, there were no generation issues that were identified, which means we're in a pretty good state here. So we can kind of trust what we see in this report. And then the next to the last tab, the Skyline Collector Health, is kind of a view of all of the endpoints that are in our cloud services organization, right? Our Skyline organization, not just those that we checked the boxes for in our report. This is kind of everything. And this is really helpful if, for example, you want to know which vCenters had communication issues, right? You could kind of look through here and you'd be able to kind of figure out, this vCenter wasn't included, likely because it hasn't been uploading data for quite some time. So yeah, these are just more of kind of informational status of the service at the time that the report was generated, informational pages. Since we've covered those, we'll go back here to vCenters, right? This is really kind of where the meat of the inventory begins. One of the questions we'll get often about this report is if you start looking at the detail, you'll see that the same vCenter is listed multiple times. And I guess part of what we're going to cover today is more just kind of some Excel tips. But if we kind of click in this top left corner here and select all of our cells, we can actually just double click the space between two of these columns. That'll automatically resize all of our columns so that we can kind of see what we're looking at. Just something to, I didn't want to assume that most folks know that, but it's a pro tip there for Excel users. But we can kind of see in here when we're looking at vCenter names that there's the same vCenter listed multiple times, which is kind of quirky, right? You wouldn't necessarily expect that on a vCenters tab. But what you'll notice is that we don't have a data centers tab. So vCenters is really kind of a mashup of vCenter detail and data center detail. So we'll have one row in this vCenter tab for each data center that's in a vCenter, right? So the number of rows in here may not match up with what you would normally expect from just a vCenter account. All right, and then one of the other things we can do, while we're looking at this and kind of just talking about, that row level detail, and we can see how many clusters are in each of these data centers and how many VMs are in. If we go out here, there's like some summary information. How many VMs are, for example, in each data center? We may want to know that information at a vCenter level as opposed to a data center level. So like the easiest way that I know of to kind of get that summary information is to just insert a pivot table into our Excel spreadsheet. The default here, selects all of our rows and says it wants to create a new worksheet for our pivot table. And we can just go through here and kind of select some fields that we'd want to group by. So for example, we could scroll through here and find our vCenter name, make that a row, and then just check the box for number of hosts, number of CPUs, number of VMs, right? And this is going to summarize, add all of those numbers together per data center for us and give us a picture at a vCenter level of the summary of inventory. And then if we want to go through, we can actually just check this data center name box, right? And this will kind of break that back out and kind of show us that for each vCenter, we may have multiple data centers. This gives us that, summary information that we saw on the vCenters tab, but also gives us the subtotals per vCenter and the grand total across, all of the inventory that's in this report. All right, so that's some of what's on the vCenter tab, and then just a couple Excel tips on summarizing the detail that's in there. Any questions on any of what we covered there on vCenters?
Not so much just on that, but one of the questions we had, and it's our French guy. If the report comes back as blank, what is the steps that we should do, or maybe a customer should do to contact Skyline support or whatever to find out why?
Yeah, I've seen blank reports before. typically right after someone onboards to the service. In the past, so this feature was introduced in January, but it's really an evolution of a feature that was introduced maybe 2 years ago, where TAMs could create this report. In the past, there was, the customer would onboard to the service, and then as a kind of a separate step, at some point after onboarding to the service, they would go enable the TAM functionality. And so once they would enable the TAM functionality, a couple of days later, we would get data that could be reported on. And so sometimes just kind of if timing were off, the report could run and there would be no data in it. Other times there's been periods in the past where like the ETL process that kind of populates all this data may have, went askew or whatnot. Sometimes when that happens, kind of on that tab there at the end, that says report status, it'll say something went wrong, or there was a known issue that somebody's aware of and working on. Other than that, I think if a customer had an issue with like a blank report, I guess a couple of things. One, I would maybe wait a bit and try again just to see if there's a problem that could have taken care of itself.
Okay.
Kind of second would be, I think most of the Skyline support, there's like a VMware community page where there's like group type support for Skyline. I'm assuming that that's moving. Here's part of the day 2 stuff in a few weeks. Support ticket through GSS is always an option, but for internal folks, or customers who have TAMs, they could reach out to their TAMs, and there is a shared SaaS services service desk where we could open a ticket if it's kind of a persistent problem.
Thanks, Brian.
Yeah, no problem. All right, so that's the vCenters tab. We'll just kind of take our paces through these tabs. I mean, if somebody has a question, let me know. I'll try to point out, I mentioned this is a relatively new feature customer facing, but some of the data has been around for TAMs to be able to report on for some time. So some of the improvements like on this cluster tab, used to we had a flag on whether HA and DRS were enabled at a cluster level. In the most recent improvements, right, that happened back in the January timeframe, where this was introduced to customers and also expanded for TAMs. There's some additional detail around like HA admission control and the virtual machine component protection and how that's enabled at a cluster level. And then one of the kind of nice to haves right out here toward the end is whether or not vSAN is enabled for a specific cluster, right? That's one of the questions we used to want to answer and didn't have a great way of doing, but today we've got just kind of a true false out here on whether or not vSAN is enabled. So that's something new. And again, I didn't do this earlier, but auto resizing all the columns is a thing I like to do. And then also on the data tab, there's a filter button. I like turning that on because that gives me these little drop downs that I can filter by. If I wanted to specifically look at one vCenter or whatnot, I could do something like that. I guess this is another question that has come up before around like counts. Like if we go back to the pivot table we created before, this one vCenter has 4 data centers underneath it. But like when we're looking at clusters, there's only 3 rows of clusters, right? Like why aren't there 4, right? We get those questions from time to time about like discrepancies between counts. In this case, right, there's a data center that doesn't have a cluster in it, right? And so that row doesn't exist here because this is just looking at clusters. Likewise, we could have a data center that had dozens of clusters in it. And in that case, we'd have more rows and clusters than we have data center objects. So that's one of the reasons why we'll, from time to time, see some discrepancies here. All All right, so that's vCenters, clusters. Now we just keep drilling down our inventory into hosts. I guess I'll pause real quick. Any questions out there from folks before we talk about hosts?
I have not. There is a question that we need to do after the recording.
Okay, cool. All right, so hosts, right? This is a super helpful table for many reasons. But one of the, I guess, again, we'll turn on our auto filtering. We'll highlight all of the columns. We'll auto resize so that it's a little bit easier to kind of read and see what's in here. We got host, make, model, CPU information, right? Those things are all super helpful if you're trying to do like a life cycle check, right? Does this host support vSphere beta update 2, for example? It gives you the detail that you would need to go check the HCL to confirm something like that. Has a little bit of info about just a lot of things, right? What vCenter it's in, what cluster is it in. You can see there's a few rows in here that don't have cluster names or cluster IDs. Those are hosts that are standalone hosts, not in clusters, right? It's a real thing. As far as like new columns in this report, not many for that January release. One that's probably of interest to TAMs and such is the host BIOS version. That column was added to the host report. Again, super helpful with some of those lifecycle exercises. When you see that, the HPE, ProLiant, Gen 10, whatever is supported with vSphere 8.0 update 2, but it may say you need to be running a specific BIOS version. You can get that data from this report. All right, so that's host, DVS, distributed switches, right? Again, not all clusters are going to have one of these, or not all data centers are going to have one of these. Again, we'll do some resizing here. Just get some kind of generic information about where this distributed switch lives in the inventory, what the name is. One of the columns kind of recently added to this report is the number of hosts, which is super helpful, right? Again, when we're doing a lifecycle exercise like a vCenter 8.0 upgrade, right? Let's turn on our auto filtering and say that we want to upgrade this one vCenter to 8.0 update 2, right? There's vCenter can only manage distributed switches that are in -2, right? So 8.0, 7, 6.7, right? This distributed switch that's running version 6.5 is actually going to give me an error when I go through like the upgrade workflow. I believe there's a Skyline finding and recommendation around this that says you have distributed switches that are at a version that'll prevent a vCenter 8 upgrade. And so the guidance would be to go look at this distributed switch and schedule a time to upgrade it. But as we can see, right, like this distributed switch actually isn't used. It's not attached to any VMs or hosts. So really the easiest thing to do would just be to delete this switch. And this switch is one that I specifically created for this example, right? It's kind of a contrived example, but it's not attached to hosts. So the kind of easy solution would be just to delete it.
Brian, and if they had a standard switch, would it still show up under this DVS tab?
No, standard
Okay.
switches would not be in here.
Okay.
Good question though.
Because I saw the type, so it made me kind of wonder if that's where it would be. So.
Yeah, I'm not aware of any sort of like weird upgrade restrictions or whatnot related to standard switches. Yeah. It's mostly on that DVS side. I guess just to kind of build on this example why number of hosts is helpful, right? In the previous report, we had number of VMs, but there is a scenario, right, where you have a distributed switch that has no VMs on it, but it's still used, right? Like vSAN comes to mind where you might have VM kernel ports related to vSAN, right? No VMs, but definitely a distributed switch that you would care about and need. So the addition of number of hosts kind of helps us ensure that this switch for sure unused and would likely be safe to just remove without having to deal with an upgrade or anything like that.
Now that I think about my standard switch question, it was kind of unnecessary because you would have one per host that would show up on this list, so that makes no sense at all.
Yeah, there was some talk at one point about like expanding this table to include like port group details as well, and so that's where that type column comes from.
Okay.
Instead of a virtual switch, it'd be like a port group or something like that. And the decision was made just to not include that because it'd be a lot of detail potentially, and not really a great mapping back to like, we would see that this port group is used by one VM, but we wouldn't necessarily know which VM.
Right.
So the decision was made just to kind of keep it at the switch level.
Makes sense.
All right. So that's DVS. We'll get into VMs. Again, just like turning on my auto filter and auto resizing to kind of see what I've got in here. Kind of lots of good stuff, really kind of functionally between the previous TAM version of this report and the January release where it was open to customers. There's no changes to this data, right? So this would be what you see from what you've always had. Lots of columns though, right? One of the questions we get often about this data is that if I scroll through here, I may have quite a few more rows than I would have expected, right? Like this is a small lab environment. There's 500 some rows. In larger environments, folks will see more stuff. And the kind of what's in here, right, is not just virtual machines, right, powered on and powered off, but also templates and any SRM placeholders. So if folks are using Site Recovery Manager, you're probably aware that it creates like a kind of a second copy of the VM at the recovery site. Those would be in here. If I scroll all the way to the very last column, we've got this kind of yes/no field that kind of denotes whether something is an SRM placeholder or not. In this environment, there are no SRM placeholders, but just kind of for mechanics, right? That's one of those things that could cause more rows is if we see a lot of SRM placeholders. And then likewise, there's a column in here somewhere along the way about templates. Boop, boop, boop. There it is template, right? And so like I could, now I've got my auto filtering turned on, I could remove all of my VMs and I could see that I have 61 templates in this inventory. And that's one of those things that could be skewing my counts, right? Or the reason why I think I might have more VMs in the report than I should, right? Or the kind of combination of templates and SRM placeholders. Lots of good things in here. Right, one thing I was gonna just create another quick pivot table on just because I thought it would be useful to kind of show what data we've got, would be capacity in gigabytes, right? So like the amount of space allocated to the VMDKs on this VM. I can throw that down here in a kind of a value, right? The sum of capacity in gigabytes. And then I could do something like maybe go find data center, throw that in here as a row, for example. And then another thing we have is like power state, right? So I could maybe throw a filter in for power state, and I could say of all of my powered off VMs, where, how much space am I using, right? You can see here in one of my data centers, I've got 30 terabytes or so worth of disk used by powered off VMs. And so that might be something I want to go, focus on this data center first, as far as like cleaning something up. And again, pivot table was more of just to summarize it. We can get the same detail, from this VMs tab, right? We could go find our power state column. We've got our auto filtering turned on, so we could just go look at all of our powered on or powered off stuff. Got to get the right checkbox there. And we could do the same thing, right? We could just come in here and we could sort largest to smallest, we could find our VMs that have the most disk space allocated to them that are powered off. All right, there's some licensing stuff in here as well. I'm not going to dig into that, just in the interest of both time and not sharing my keys with the world.
Brian, before you move away from this tab, I think it's also important to highlight, you could also see, customers could also see limits or reservations for VMs. I think that's useful.
Yeah,
Well,
there's lots of columns out here, right?
Yeah.
And so kind of reading through the list and seeing what you've got, some of the tools version, how long VMs have been up. I do think, like you said, I think there's a memory allocation limit where -1 is unlimited. So all of these don't have limits, and then CPU allocation limit, I wouldn't expect any either. But again, reservations, right? This VM has a reservation. I typically try and remove those in a lab, so I probably won't have a whole lot in here. But again, your mileage may vary. Snapshot use space. This is in bytes, so you got to do some math on this to get this into like a useful number, because it's a pretty big number to swallow. But I think if we did the math on this, that snapshot's actually probably relatively small. Let's see, anything else? Create date. We probably see some that are 1970 or whatever.
I wasn't going to comment on that, but I was going to see what those were.
Yeah, so create date is a API attribute that was introduced in vSphere 6.7. So VMs created prior to 6.7 have a create date of 0, and 0 in Linux time is this January 1st of 1970.
I learned some history just then.
Yeah, so this is really more of a just a representation of what that API returns. So like if you're doing something, PowerShell or whatnot, and you see that 1970 date, or really anytime you see that date, it means somebody has a 0 value, and then they're doing math, adding 0 to that's how Unix time works. It adds that number of ticks or whatever to that date, and that's what this actual value ends up being. So these are things that just go way back to, we don't have a beginning timestamp.
So that'd be one good way of finding out the longest living VMs, at least, like what came from 65655, whatever,
Yeah, and probably doesn't give us like that origin date, but again, we could do like a pivot table to do something like I think there's a version field in here. This is the compatibility hardware version.
Mhm.
And we could do, something like this where we put count of name over here, right? So we could see kind of our distribution. If we have anything that's super old, like VMX04 or something, may want to go check and see what that is. But
would the date change if they upgraded the tools or the hardware version? Or would
no, I don't think so.
Okay.
And that create date attribute in the API is read only. I spent some time trying to figure out if there's a way you could force data in there, and I don't think that exists.
That's good to know.
All right, so I think that's data stores, right? Data stores. This is a new tab as well, right? This was introduced in January, and so didn't exist before that. But again, this is some pretty good detail on VMFS versus NFS versus vSAN should be in here as well, and it gives us the used capacity and total capacity, so we could do some math to get the free capacity if we were interested in it. We could see number of hosts, that sort of thing. So this is kind of interesting if you see like a data store that you would think would be a shared data store, but maybe only one host has access to it. There could be some sort of provisioning thing that's needs looked at. VMFS version is kind of interesting, right? Like all of this stuff is probably 6.x, but if you saw like a VMFS 5 thing, right, you would know that likely a new LUN and storage migration effort might be in order at some point, but you'd be able to at least see that at the data store level. Cool. Well, let me, again, like I said, we're in the interest of time, I did want to show one other report. It's going to be roughly the same for most of the tabs, but wanted to touch on the VCF report because it's way improved from where it was in that kind of pre-January release where only TAMs had access to it. Like back prior to January, there was a VCF report, but it basically just showed the VCF SDDC managers and the VCF domains that were in those managers. And that was kind of the end of the inventory, right? It was the stuff that made VCF unique was in this VCF report. And you just kind of had these two tabs of detail. With the improvements in January, there's actually this kind of discovery query process that happens that also populates all of the vCenter detail, for all of the, so we pick a VCF manager. VCF is aware of, which vCenters are managed by that SDDC manager. If those vCenters are in Skyline, right? So like from like a workflow of a Skyline collector, I would add my VCF environment. I would also have to add vCenters and ARIA Suite Lifecycle Manager, and all of the individual components would have to be added into Skyline collector. But if Skyline was aware of associated inventory, this VCF report has many tabs, right? So we have all of our vSphere stuff that we just talked through with the vSphere prefix, but the same tab name other than that we just looked at, but also other kind of associated suite lifecycle endpoints, right? So like I've got a ARIA operations for logs associated with this VCF environment. There's a automation. This VCF environment that we're looking at doesn't actually have ARIA automation deployed, but it does have operations for logs. And so the reason I included just the VCF report was because it actually includes a lot of this associated inventory, right? I can see my operation for logs, my cluster name, and then the individual nodes. Again, this is kind of a single node cluster, if you will, right? I have a VIP for log insight, but only one node in that cluster. And the clustered nodes have version numbers and build numbers. So like in a real world sense, you'd probably see, maybe 5 rows. You'd have your cluster name and then like 4 like ARIA ops for logs worker nodes. Each of those, should have the same version and build number, but it may not, right? Something may have went weird with patching or whatnot, but we'd have that detail in here. And again, just all of the associated things with VCF would pull into this report. NSXT was unhealthy in this environment when I was getting this going. It's corrected now, but the last report I ran, right, this tab is blank simply because the NSXT endpoint was unhealthy. But this discovery query is pretty cool, right? Being able to get all of that associated VCF inventory into a single file is nice because you can kind of see all those relationships and kind of browse through all the things that are relevant here. And basically most, if not all of the tabs have a SDDC manager and domain ID column, right? So if I ran a vCenter report standalone, not starting from VCF, right? Like the one we looked at earlier. And, I was looking at like vCenters, for example, those columns are there and would be populated. When I ran this sample report a few days ago, my VCF environment was powered off. I hadn't been using it in a while, so it's not populated in here. But if I were to run it today, I would get these fields populated. Cool. Well, that I think is the end of the notes of things that I was going to try and cover. So I'll pause. Any questions, comments?
Yeah, if you have any questions, please unmute or ask in the chat. But right now, it's just follow up for after the recording. I think you did good, Brian.
Cool. Appreciate the opportunity to present.
Yeah, thank you for Brian hit us up a while back asking about this, and we're still trying to figure out what we're going to do moving forward with TAM Lab. Again, if you have anything, please reach out to us. We would love to help you present, because anything that we can help customers do is going to benefit all of us. Last chance, if you got a question, shoot it out.
Let's stop the recording and get the good questions.
Yeah, we're gonna. What was that? Someone says that before. I want to do that.
Okay, Teddy. This is Teddy.
Yeah.
Okay, so my question is that if you're with a customer that has an offline, which was like the government, and how can we get insights from those reports and keep it offline? Like Power BI is not acceptable. Do we have anything with Broadcom or any tool that we can have, like a virtual machine internally at the customer where we can run those, an offline version, take those reports, or take the TDM actually, and put it there so we can run those reports and get insights? Because usually now, currently, we have only the Excel sheets. Those are not going to give us justice to really analyze or evaluate the customer's environment.
So Brian, is there anything today that I don't have any, government customers like that I've had to experience? What is there today that they could do, or is it as like Simon said, the Skyline Health Diagnostics is for offline, or the TDM?
TDM is the route I would take, right? So the Skyline Inventory Export, used to be called Data Export, or whatever the precursor, maybe. I think it was called Data Export before it was renamed Inventory Export. The whole kind of schema and the columns that are in here were modeled after TDM. So I would say TDM would be the tool that exists today to kind of get this in an offline fashion.
Yeah, TDM is accepted, and they can use it. But we take the data from TDM or Skyline and we put them in our insights and vSphere Insight, and we can get really better visualization of the data and everything that comes with it. So the question is, how can we do that offline?
So Teddy, I think that might be something we follow up after the recording. That might be something that's going to be in a futures. So let me go ahead and stop this recording. And for those that are watching this, if I don't edit this out, there should be a future one, hopefully after day 2. So let me go ahead and stop this. Thank you all.